Hey everybody, this is Michael DeSilva's part 1 of Talking with Your Kids, lesson 7. And we're dealing with chapter 6 in the book, which I've already read, but we're just doing it. And it's entitled, in the chapter, is titled Big Sins, Little Sins. I'm going to talk a little bit in detail about that. Alright. But before we do, let's go to Lord in prayer. Dear Lord, as I pray, and we come together tonight, that you'll bless me with the teaching and the content that we're about to share here tonight will help parents, both new to the game as well as those who are seasoned parents, to be able to have more ideas on how to handle their kids when they're not always an easy thing to handle. Help me, Lord, to be able to share this knowledge and to communicate in such a way so it's easy to duplicate and understand. And be with us tonight as we learn. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. All right, so everyday talk and everyday listening and everyday decisions, all right, now these are all activities that define your parenting style or ability. So they also reveal whether or not your parenting is ordinary or I like to call extraordinary or holy. So the book says. It says what is important here is that you will donate your thinking and the way you talk about and listen and give directions to your children shows that this is important to you. And also that it shows how you communicate to your kids about what you think is most important. All right?
30 minutes remaining.
Now, that's a little timer I got going. All right, are the things that are important to you also important to God? Now this is an easy way to summarize what it really means to be holy as opposed to being just ordinary. It says if your mind is focused on what the word or what the world says to do of what's important, then you are just ordinary. However, if you are focused on what God says that's important, then you have taken a vital step towards holiness living. Or, and like I like to say, being an extraordinary parent, because you're being holy and modeling your behavior after that and instilling that in your children. All right, so when you are continually trying to line up your priorities with God's priorities, says your everyday talk and walk will be transformed into everyday talk that pleases God. Says now we already have discussed on how to give directions and also how to respond when your children or child sin against you. Said perhaps by now you're probably thinking, okay, I know when to speak pleasantly, right? Says, I know I should always respond with love rather than with impatience and anger. Says, but God did punish the Israelites eventually. They did have to suffer for their rebellious behavior. Just like when our children misbehave, they too in turn get punished. Okay? Alright, now, when do I finally get around to consequences and discipline? That's the question I want to ask you tonight. Okay? We discussed about how to respond and everything, but now we want to talk about how do we do this. All right. Well, that's a good question. All right. To answer it, let's now go back. Let's back up a little bit. All right. Now, a holy response to your child's behavior or sin is not a substitute for discipline. Okay. Rather, it is simply the way you talk when you discipline your child. It says it enhances discipline It enables for you to exercise discipline most effectively. Okay? Now, an ordinary parent who's exasperated responds by using clouds of discipline that's issued because it focuses at least some, but if not all, the attention on the parent's reaction says the child is busy avoiding his parent's wrath. It says either literally or figuratively. It says in contrast, a holy or self-controlled response goes right to the heart, the very heart of the problem here. It says the child's sin against God and forces him or her to deal with that issue, all right, as a parent. It says you cannot discipline properly until you see yourself as God's agent to your kids. That's really what we are as parents. We're really agents to our children, on His behalf. We're like instruments. So both you and they are accountable, first of all, to God. Now let me say this again. It says your children are accountable to God for their obedience to you, and, oh goodness, and you are accountable to God for raising your children to fear Him. Okay? Therefore, your focus in discipline is to hold your children accountable to God's standards. All right? Now, there's a chart on page 41, okay, that shows those two facts should control your parenting priorities. All right? Now, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. It says this is basic training or instructions. It says most Christian parents will not argue with this point. However, more often than not, parents do not enforce this command consistently, though. It says either from ignorance or to serve their own convenience. All right, to the very extent that they are inconsistent. It says they do not help their child or children grow in obedience, in the ways of obedience and love towards God. Now, another question is, when do I discipline? When do I discipline? Well, the issues are important enough to discipline. Okay. Well, let me read that again. What are the issues? What are issues? Or what issues are important enough to discipline? All right, okay, that's when you discipline. It says, and what issues do I overlook? Okay, well, many parents struggle with this question because they have no consistent basis, for discipline. It says the question comes up again and again, over and over. It says, now let me illustrate that of what I really mean here. It says, in this example, there's a 4-year-old boy by the name of Andrew, and he is running all through the house. Now, Michelle, who is now on the phone, which is his mother, he flies by the kitchen table. He then now stumbles, plowing right into the table and knocking off a plastic cup that was full of water. Now, Michelle, his mom, picks him up and makes sure that he's okay, and then tells him not to worry about it. Says it was just only water that spilled, that's all. He smiles, and then his mom smiles back at him and gives him a pat on the back, or on the head, you might as well, or back, and then resumes her phone conversation with her friend. Says, even though Michelle, his mother, told him not to run through the kitchen, a million times before. She doesn't mention that to him this time. Says, after all, it was only a cup of water, and she's in the middle of a conversation on the phone with somebody. Says the next day, Michelle, his mother, is again at her kitchen table talking on the telephone, just like before. This time, however, she is cleaning her fine crystal, dishes, stemware. Andrew again then races right through the house and stumbles and plows right into the table and knocks over a piece of her fine crystal. It's probably handed down to her from, her grandparents and maybe great-grandparents, so it's probably of some value, and it has sentimental value. Says to the floor, this piece of stemware falls to the floor with a crash, and where it shatters, and Andrew looks up, with a smile, with a small smile on his face, expecting the same result that happened the day before. But instead, Michelle, his mom, hangs up the telephone quickly and angrily yells at Andrew that he really done it this time. Now, how many times have I told you not to run through this house? Okay, that's what she says. Now look what you've done. Says, do you know how expensive that was? Andrew starts crying consistently, and he is now confused. Yesterday, what seemed to be the same thing was treated as if it didn't really matter. Today, he is a monster. And yesterday, a little sin was overlooked. Today, a big sin is punished. Big sins, little sins. That's why we call this chapter. A lot of parents do this, which is not the right way to raise your children. And I'll explain more here in a bit. Or the author will go into that. It says, what was the difference between the two events here? Okay. Well, first of all, the only apparent damage was spilt water in the first demonstration. Certainly nothing to engage to discipline over. Okay, right? But the second time, the damage was to a piece of shattered stemware, that was treasured crystal, that was handed down probably. But think about this for a moment with me. What was the real sin that was committed here? Okay. Was it not Andrew running when he was told not to? Right? Yet Michelle is concerned enough to discipline only when a major loss of crystal occurs. Says, you see, the wrong comparison here is the shattered crystal and the spilled water. Says both are the results of Andrew's disobedience to what she's asked him not to do. So Michelle's failure to require obedience, this is ordinary things are too important to Michelle. Okay? Alright. Now, whatever's important to God is holy. Now, if you distinguish it this way between little sins and big sins, what you're thinking here is not holy, but ordinary. Okay? Now, God does not want to have a category of big sins, meaning those which a parent gets really upset about, and little sins, which are those the parent will usually overlook or ignore. Now, what he wants is God wants to be loved and to be obeyed at all times, whether it's a big sin or a little sin. All right, not just when the consequences seem great to us, but you must discipline your children or child every time they are disobedient. It says, as God's agent, that's who you are, you do not have the right to excuse or to ignore your child's disobedience. God requires for you as a parent to bring up your children in the fear of the Lord. Now, you may not make obedience a trivial or an occasional issue. It says when a child or children are deliberately disobedient, it says you have no choice but to exercise discipline out of love for God and love for your child or children. Okay? It says now you can easily see how this big sin, little sin scenario mentally, profoundly influences your everyday talk and also walk. Since the first incident was only about spilled water, nothing really registered on the parent's radar screen when it really should have. It says the phone call was more important, but in reality, what was of greater importance was that Andrew was disobeying his mother, Michelle, and therefore God remembers, like in Ephesians 6:1. It says by running where he was told not to run. If Michelle had concerned about the seriousness of the disobedience, Andrew would have been disciplined for the first time. It says not for spilling the water, however, but for running through the house when he was not supposed to be doing that. Now perhaps the second incident here with the shattered valuable stemware crystal would never have happened if Andrew had been properly challenged the day before. See? So, it is dangerous to judge the seriousness of sin by the consequences. And take that approach, it's what you're doing, the big little sin mentality. Okay, because all sins in God's eye are considered big. You tell a lie, it's just as big as committing adultery. They're all sinful, and they pull you away from God. See, well, that's the same one with your children. They're no different. If they lie to you, it's just as bad as stealing from you. There's no difference in level. Consequences are not different either. The consequence for sin is discipline. Now, Andrew was being equally disobedient here on both accounts. Okay. Yet the first time, when the consequences were minimal, there was no rebuke, only a smile, and, hey, no problem with that. Perhaps Mom even gave himself a pat on the back for being so patient and kind and not getting her upset. It says in the second circumstance, says the consequences were substantial, and so was Andrew's discipline. It says, yet Andrew's sin was no worse the second time than in the first, when he ran when he was told not to do so. All right? Now, big sins are little sins. All right? If Michelle had been seriously concerned about Andrew's disobedience, she would have seen him running as a big deal. All right? Now, the conversation here that Andrew's mom had with him immediately after each incident is an example of profound importance of everyday talk as a parent. It says in both situations, she did not really think much about what she said to him. She just reacted with speech that was constant with what was important to her. Okay? The first time, the phone call was most important and spilled water was not important at all. It says, therefore, her everyday talk reflected those priorities. Now let's make sure that Andrew is all right so that I can get right back to talking on the phone with my phone call. Okay? Now, if training Andrew is love God had been the most important thing, okay, that's demonstrated in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 7, then she would have seen the running through the house as a big deal and gotten quickly off that phone to confront and discipline him about that. Okay? So that's what it's all about, you know. We have to do things like this because all sins are big in the eyes of God. And if we're teaching people like that, that's why people are so messed up in the church today about things like that. All right? Discipline him for his disobedience. All right? Now, her immediate reaction revealed what was important to her, as we said earlier. So such incident demonstrate whether the big sins, the little sins mindset is at work here. It says the second incident, Michelle was very angry at Andrew because of the cost of the crystalware. It says her immediate words to Andrew reflect that value was the main cause of why she got mad at him. It says, but as valuable as crystal is, it pales in comparison to the value of loving God with all your heart, mind, and strength. It says Andrew was dishonoring really God by disobeying his parents and his mother. The direction. Andrew's mom was dishonoring God because she did not help Andrew see the very importance of obedience to God in her as a parent. It says her everyday talk exposed her values. Andrew will likely remember this event as the time he got in really big trouble for breaking expensive crystalware. However, of greater importance is the fact that Andrew was not loving God by obeying Michelle, his mother. It says the real sin in this scenario was the lost amidst of pieces of shattered crystal. All right, when it should have really been the actual deed of running through the house. It says the consequences of sin are not always quickly known. It says sometimes consequences are immediately predictable, like jumping out of an airplane without a parachute. Of course, you're going to either get hurt seriously or you're going to die. It says, but most of the time, the consequences are harder to discern. It says, if Andrew decides to disobey mother and run, then he can't really know if he will spill water or break crystal or be undetected. It says the danger is to decide based upon which consequences he most likely. All right, if Andrew thinks that he might break some crystal and then get into some big trouble and decides not to run through the house for that very reason, what he has not made a decision to love God, but rather to protect himself. This is not the everyday obedience that God desires here, okay? It is self-interest is what's here, what's happening there, okay? Now, it doesn't take too much, imagination here to apply this example to other situations. It says if you think you might get a speeding ticket, then you probably won't speed, right? Well, if you think that by speeding you will get it, you will get to work on time, then you might speed. Now, making a decision on these two very factors alone is not serving God. It is serving yourself or your own interest. This is an example of the big sin, little sins mentality or mindset. Now let's try another example here. Now Kevin is a young teenage boy, and has an opportunity to be alone with Tiffany, who is a girl from middle school. With a reputation of being sexually active with other boys. All right, now, if he thinks that he might get caught alone with her, and his parents will find out, or that he might get a sexually transmitted disease from this girl, then he might decide not to be alone with her. However, suppose she successfully entices him into thinking that no one will find out. See Proverbs chapter 7, and that a little fun never hurts anyone. Now he might, what will happen here is, he might be willing and be persuaded to be alone with this young, lady. This is an example of the big sins, little sins way of thinking here. It says if both of these examples, or the consequences are influencing the very actions here, it says what is the best way to love God is not even being in consideration here. All right? Now, parent, when you discipline for big sins and overlook the little sins, as people often do, in this kind of mindset, which is not what you should do, says what you are doing is you are setting a bad example for your children or child. Says you are teaching them by your own example to obey only when it seems necessary to them. What they can get out of it. But it's not what it's about. It says you are teaching your children that it's quite okay to disobey if they don't get caught doing it. It says you are showing them that pleasing God is not really very important value. And certainly it's not even worth much inconvenience or self-denial either. Okay? So, now one day, there was a 4-year-old boy by the name of Andrew who will become 14 years old one day. And Andrew, what will keep him from falling into the trap of temptation or of, sexual temptation here is if he is only choosing the actions that are only based on how serious he thinks the consequences will be, then he is setting a duck. It says when temptation is testing and luring him, he will gamble his life that the consequences will be only spilled water and not broken crystalware. All right? It says, but if he is thinking of what will please and honor God, then he will receive the protection this holy sword of thinking provides. Now look at Proverbs chapter 6, verses 20 through 24, where it teaches you this way of thinking. Okay? It says, my son, keep your father's commandments and do not forsake your mother's teachings. It says, bind them upon your heart and forever fasten them around your very neck. It says, when you walk, they will guide you. Okay, and when you sleep, they will watch over you. And when you awake the next morning, they will speak to you. All right. So for these commandments are a lamp. All right. This teaching is a light unto the path in the correction of discipline on the way that leads to eternal life. Now, keeping you from the immoral woman, from the smooth tongue of the wayward wife, in Proverbs 6 verses 20 through 24. This is where we see, again, the big sin, little sin thinking here. It says it will not offer the protections that these verses do provide or offer. It says your everyday talk must reflect a deep concern for loving and serving God through everyday obedience. All right? Now, if you show your children or child that your decisions are based upon the seriousness of the consequences, then you will lead them into the big sin, little sin way of thinking, which is not what we want. Now, if Andrew listens or learns that he is really loving and pleasing God by obeying you, by not running all through the house, then he will be protected by his love for God and his word. It says this mindset is the very result of everyday talk. It says day after day, year after year, that parents pleasing God as the highest goal and desire, says your instructions to your children.
3, 2, 1.
Okay, that's where we'll stop.
4.6 seconds over.
Okay. All right, well, we're going to continue with part 2. So stay